The Monday American podcast is proudly brought to you by the Podcast Advocate Network. What you're about to listen to is part 2 of the story of the Vietnam War. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I'd highly suggest doing so. But if you're someone who can pick up in the middle of the story, then by all means, keep listening. It is a free country after all. And before we dive into the story, the continuation of the story of the cluster that is Vietnam and America, I'd like to take a quick second to again thank you, the listeners, for allowing us to make this show almost entirely ad-free. And I just wanted to say thank you to all those of you listening who have supported the show in any way, whether it's by listening, whether it is by supporting financially through a donation or buying merchandise, whatever it is, it's all helpful in any way, shape, or form. And the fact that I get people such as, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering this name, Tracy Colecci, it's a difficult one, and I thought I had a difficult last name, who reach out and send me a simple message on Facebook to say, hey, I love the show, I love what you're doing, keep it up. That's all the payment I could ever ask for. And as a cherry on top, she mentioned that she listens to the show with her 3.5-year-old who is now saying phrases like during the war. And I will take full blame on that. And I think you've got a great kid there. So I, again, just wanted to say and send my sincerest thank you to all of those of you listening. So thank you.
You're listening to The Monday American, the show that puts the story back into history. Making history come alive, one episode at a time. The show made for the people, by the people. Visit theMondayAmerican.com to get more. Dive into The Monday American. Don't worry, we'll be gentle.
When we finished off the last episode, at the end of that episode, we were starting to see a strengthening mutual decline based on each other's actions for a multitude of countries who were in this partnership of doom, it seemed like. American involvement had begun to escalate under President John F. Kennedy's administration from January of 1961 to November of 1963. Now, by then, North Vietnam had established a very strong presence in the neighboring country of Laos and was building up in Cambodia as well. One of the biggest aspects of the entire war was this Chi Minh Trail. They named it after their leader of the Communist Party, Ho Chi Minh. They used it in order to resupply and reinforce their forces that were in South Vietnam. Kennedy saw American efforts in Southeast Asia almost as a crusade, and he believed that increasing the military advisor program on top of political reform in South Vietnam would strengthen the South, it would effectively shut down the trail, and bring peace. The one thing they did not account for is the key to the question of how do you fight a war against a superior enemy with superior technology and forces. All they had to do was think about how that would be done, and they could be able to, maybe not entirely, but at least somewhat predict the movements of Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese. Because the answer to that question is that you make them fight on your level. The North Vietnamese army, the Viet Cong, they fought with almost no technology. And they found the key ingredient. They forced the United States to fight on their terms. And no war can be won if you're fighting on your enemy's terms. In a guerrilla warfare, you can drag that thing on forever. In February of 1961, the United States launched, based on a successful program that the British had employed against an insurrection in Malaya, the Strategic Hamlet program. It was a shining and glaring example of a very crucial part of the war that America did not understand, and that was the country itself. Very few people spoke Vietnamese that were American over there. What we did not understand from the get-go was the culture of Vietnam. This is a farm culture in South Vietnam. It was a culture that subsisted on sustenance farming and their rice fields. Now, part of the problem was that General Westmoreland, the head of all the American forces in Vietnam, he had a strategy of war by attrition, and it presented the average person in Vietnam with only three basic choices: stay on land and risk getting killed by U.S. or communist firepower, join the VC and become the target of U.S. firepower, or move to areas under Saigon's government control, which really meant a refugee camp. Quite a few, of course, chose option 2 and took up arms with the VC. Many more took the unhappy third route. He said, quote, "I expect a tremendous increase in the number of refugees," as he was talking to reporters. This was, of course, exactly what happened. 1 in 4 South Vietnamese people became a refugee between 1965 and the following 4 years in 1969. Now, for being entirely fair about where this whole issue of American misunderstanding of Vietnamese language, culture, people, country, traditions, everything stems from, you can't solely blame it on the government. A lot of it dealt with the overall behavior of the Army and Marine soldiers, Marines aren't soldiers, the Army soldiers and the Marines that were there. They dealt with people harshly. They used racial slurs. They would break squad rules about refraining from drinking and whoring, or just generally projected ill will. Far more often, cultural problems resulted from simple American ignorance about local customs. Marines, like most Americans, tended to pat kids on the head until they found out that many villagers believed this infested those kids that they were patting with evil spirits. They also had to learn to avoid crossing their legs or pointing their heels at their hosts when sitting in someone's home. In America, that's not a really big deal. To the Vietnamese, the pointed heel meant that the person at whom it was pointed would die the next day. One soldier, Lieutenant Egan, he found one day, to his chagrin, that he committed a gratuitous cultural insult. He wrote in his diary about it, said, quote, "All I had done was walk into a hooch," which is what they called their straw huts, and said something to one of the old men in the ville and turned my back on his family altar without paying any sort of respect to it. In a culture that was centered around ancestry and ancestral worship, this was one of the most grave offenses you could offer. And it was no small matter, tactically speaking, either, because such an insult like that, it could easily cause the offended party to go and cast his lot with the VC, the Viet Cong, therefore putting more American lives at risk. Probably the biggest single factor that drove the Americans' misunderstanding of the Vietnamese people was their ties to their land and their ancestors. Later on in the war, after a battle, I'm kind of giving you a Quentin Tarantino version of this, but it's a phenomenal excerpt of this book in which it's called Grunts, and I've used it for several episodes for different series. It articles a long time of history from foot soldiers, but I digress. A CBS News correspondent, he remembered encountering an anguished group of about 100 refugees at the edge of a village during the height of the fighting. And this quote is gut-wrenching. He says, quote, "Their faces were twisted in contortions of grief, their mouths open, long strands of saliva spilling on the soil. Their noses dripped, tears ran down their cheeks. They shrieked and sobbed and wailed with choking throats and fluttering lungs, one after another." Nearby was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Craig. He was a division civil affairs officer. He was trying to comfort them the best he could, but like so many other soldiers there, he had decent intentions, but because he knew next to nothing of the language, culture, history, and politics of Vietnam, he wasn't really doing any good. And to top that off, there were so few interpreters in the division, he could barely even communicate with them at all. One of his Vietnamese crew finally came up and spoke to him. All the people understood, and these were the refugees, was that the American and South Vietnamese soldiers were moving them away from their land, and they were deeply upset about it. They wondered who would tend to their crops in the graves of their ancestors. No one had an answer for them. Lawrence wrote later, quote, "To take them away from their land was to take away more than their lives. It was to condemn their souls." And somehow the United States thought it was a good idea to rely on a strategy that relocated forcefully almost all of these people in South Vietnam. And the way that they chose to do that initially was through a method that they called the Strategic Hamlet program, like I said. Later, they would do it with napalm and bombs, but in the initial stages, it seemed innocent enough, although it was folly from the get-go. Now, if I made it sound as though this was the entire purpose of the Strategic Hamlets, that's not true. They were really a method to make it easier for the advisors and the South Vietnamese army, the ARVN, ARVN, could defend against the Viet Cong. And it was a disaster. The program, it was poorly managed from the get-go, and it was abandoned after only about 2 years, which just right there, again, should go to show you the lack of insight and the lack of understanding that the United States had about Vietnam and how to handle this conflict from the very beginning. For one thing, the American advisors and the American troops that were already there, that were not technically American troops yet, but that's neither here nor there, I guess. In early 63, even the most ardent supporters, like these men that were there, they knew it was fundamentally flawed, but the reason it was flawed, they didn't understand yet. And I don't understand how the United States had this approach, but the men that were there didn't respect their enemy at all. They didn't consider that they were making these strategic hamlets out in the open where they could see all the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, could see the entire defense structure that they had set up, and they could plan out their attack from the jungle surrounding it. It's unbelievable that a modern military would fail to see that problem in their setup. All that the NLF, the National Liberation Front force, had to do was worry about the base of their rural population that the United States was taking over, and they decided that they would launch a systematic and what ultimately was a very effective campaign against these key hamlets. All they did was create specially trained units to destroy them by direct attack or infiltration. Now, some Kennedy advisors continued to insist that an effective counterinsurgency program required sweeping political reforms, but Ngo Dinh Diem continued to be a stubborn thorn in the American side. He would try to appease his American, as he called them, partners, and he would institute token reforms such as the creation of a Council of Economic Advisors. Instead of broadening his government, as the Americans urged him to do, he retreated further and further into isolation, and he relied almost exclusively on Ngo Dinh Nhu, a frail and sinister man who tended toward paranoia and delusions of grandeur. And these two men personally controlled military operations and directed the Strategic Hamlet program. They brokered no interference with their American advisors. Nhu's wife, the beautiful, ambitious, and, as she was known, acid-tongued Dragon Lady, as the popular cartoon whom she was named after, it was drawn because of her, she increasingly assumed the role of spokesperson for what by 1962 had become a very narrow family oligarchy, and that is about the loosest term you can use for what was pretty much already a tyranny. The suspicious and the beleaguered Ngo family tightened rather than relaxed their controls like America begged them to do. The National Assembly, it pliantly passed laws prohibiting all types of public gatherings, weddings, funerals included, unless approved specifically by the government in advance. The regime imposed on Americans as well as Vietnamese the most rigorous censorship laws. Diem angrily terminated the contract of the Michigan State University Advisory Group, when several of its members, on returning to the United States, wrote articles that he branded to be, quote, untrue, unfair, and tendentious. The veteran Newsweek correspondent Francois Solly was kicked out of Saigon for critical remarks about Madame New. By the end of 1962, it was fairly obvious that a reappraisal was unnecessary because both the embassy and military command in Saigon exuded optimism. To some extent, as Ambassador Nolting once conceded, their bullishness derived from, quote, a whistle-while-we-work mentality, and he said it was necessary to sustain the morale amid the setbacks and frustration. In time, however, both the United States and Vietnam began to believe these highly dramatized, we'll say, in a positive fashion, reports that they were giving. And this is the entire crux of the issue of the war. It was all based on lies. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Americans were strangers in an unfamiliar country. They depended for information on the South Vietnamese government. And the South Vietnamese government was bad at most things. What they were very good at, was producing impressive statistics to back claims of their progress. Nolting and Harkin erred poorly in accepting those figures at face value. But the conflict did not lend itself to an easy analysis. They, like other observers, were very impressed by the change of climate since 1961, when the government of Ngo Dinh Diem had appeared on the verge of collapse and the Americans started getting more heavily involved. They would argue that American policy was working now, and that with time and patience, victory was attainable. Now, at the same time, there was mounting criticism of U.S. Vietnam policy arising in Washington. The administration had attempted to keep its involvement under wraps, but the rising toll of American deaths and critical newspaper reports raised questions that Americans could no longer overlook. U.S. officials spent hours investigating the journalists' reports and answering their allegations, and Kennedy himself attempted unsuccessfully to get the Times to recall David Halberstam. The president was stung by Mansfield's report, but he could not ignore the warnings of an old and valued friend of his. He immediately dispatched Hillsman and Michael Forrestal on a fact-finding mission to Vietnam. And if Kennedy was expecting good news and more of the same progress towards a positive end, he would have been sorely disappointed, because the growing evidence of the Vietnamese-American tension, as well as failure, it compounded in the uncertainty, and the tension existed at pretty much every level, and it was palpable. Restless and impatient, the Americans were eager to get on with the job while they were there. They were frustrated by the inertia that seemed to pervade through the government and the army of South Vietnam. They sought to bypass the central government and deal directly with the villagers, in effect, taking control of the war. Their arrogance was frequently manifested. One U.S. advisor conceded by an attitude of, quote, get out of my way, I'd rather do it myself. Proud and sensitive, having only recently emerged from Western rule, the Vietnamese nationalists bristled at the presumptuousness of these newcomers who sought to tell them how to run their country. A Saigon newspaper philosophized in the spring of 1963, nearly prophetically, that, quote, daily friction leads to no more love left. Not only were relations at the bottom levels bad, but at the top levels, they were growing particularly tense. The Americans urged a democratic, and I say that with quotation marks because it was nearly anything but the word, so they urged democratic reforms to secure a popular support vote. They wanted Diem to seem like he was the people's choice, but Diem perceived that such reforms would undermine rather than strengthen his regime, such as tyrants would see. He was trapped in this dilemma that he had feared from the beginning of his rule. He recognized that the American presence, although necessary to hold the line against the North, had introduced another pivotal element into the already volatile mix, and he became more and more sensitive to American criticism. Diem and Nhu were increasingly troubled by the growing number of Americans and their apparent efforts to run the entire war for them. They protested infringements of Vietnamese sovereignty. They fretted about a new colonialism. Diem complained to the French ambassador, quote, "All these soldiers, I never asked them to come here. They don't even have passports." The growing uneasiness was clearly revealed in May of 1963 when Diem had Nhu publicly question whether the United States knew what it was doing in Vietnam and proposed that U.S. forces might be reduced by as many as 5,000 soldiers. Then sometime in the early summer of 63, Diem and Nhu began to explore with the North Vietnamese capital of Hanoi the possibility of a settlement based purely on American withdrawal from Vietnam. And it was in this atmosphere of confusion and mounting conflict that the Kennedy administration began to discuss the possibility of troop withdrawals. As early as the middle of 1962, the Secretary of Defense McNamara, who was famous for the numbers and data cruncher that saved the Ford Corporation, McNamara instituted a planning phase for the withdrawal of U.S. forces on the grounds that once their training function was completed, the South Vietnamese would be able to take over. Sir Robert Thompson had also proposed such a move in April of 63, advising the president that an announcement, quote, out of the blue of a 1,000-person reduction would reassure the American public and undercut the communist, quote, best propaganda line that the U.S. was running the war. Kennedy was increasingly alarmed by the South Vietnamese reaction to U.S. involvement. He told a journalist, quote, "Those people hate us. They're going to throw our asses out of there at almost any point." He was increasingly nervous about the South Vietnamese, but still worried about the potential political costs from a perceived loss of the Vietnam War back home. The president told McNamara to begin planning for overt military actions against North Vietnam and a phased withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Vietnam. Now, since then, some Kennedy advisors have argued that the president's interest in troop withdrawals confirmed his determination to avoid an open-ended commitment, and even to extricate the U.S. from Vietnam entirely. Hillsman and White House staffer Kenneth O'Donnell, they claimed by the summer of 63, Kennedy had recognized the futility of American involvement, and he was prepared to liquidate all American soldiers there. Mansfield says that Kennedy told him, quote, "If I tried to pull out completely now from Vietnam, we would have another Joe McCarthy Red Scare on our hands." Historian John Newman has gone a little bit further, claiming that Kennedy knew that the reports of success were not true, and he was determined to get out of Vietnam even if it meant the war would be considered a total loss. But, like I've said before, history deals with fact, and all of that is just speculation. They're, at the best, speculation. From the outset, the idea of a troop withdrawal was designed as a political ploy to appease the American public and reassure the South Vietnamese. The extent to which Kennedy was committed to withdrawal, it's pretty much unclear, and there was not a shred of evidence to support the notion of a secret plan for extrication. Even if he had made such a commitment, it'd be a very sad commentary on his leadership that he would be willing to risk additional American lives in a cause that he considered hopeless merely to ensure his reelection. But we'll see much worse before this war is over from much worse men than John F. Kennedy. And in what is perhaps a fiery display, pardon my pun, of the fate of history unfolding as it will, all this was going on, and at this time, if you'll remember, I told you in the last episode that Ngo Dinh Diem, the leader, was a devout Catholic, and the nation was split into sects of Catholics and Buddhists. They didn't exactly see eye to eye, but they were mostly friendly with each other and didn't have a real issue until Ngo Dinh Diem. This was called the Buddhist crisis. The affair began on May 8th in a seemingly inadvertently manner, when government troops fired into crowds that had gathered in Hue, which is South Vietnam, to protest orders forbidding the display of flags on the anniversary of Buddha's birth. That incident stirred new and vigorous protest. Buddhist leaders accused the government of religious persecution, and they demanded complete religious freedom. Unable or unwilling to conciliate his new opponents, Ngo Dinh heatedly denied the existence of persecution and blamed the disorders on the Viet Cong. How convenient. Diem's response stimulated additional protest. Buddhist priests conducted well-publicized hunger strikes, and meetings in Hue and Saigon drew large crowds, larger every day. The uprising attained new proportions, and it skyrocketed on June 11th, when a monk immolated himself in front of a large, shrieking crowd at a major intersection in downtown Saigon. And it has become since then one of the most recognizable photos in the history of the world. Sensitive to the potential value of drawing international attention to their cause, the Buddhist leadership had tipped off a foreign correspondent to the event, and an American photographer's completely candid but very poignant picture of the monk on fire and calm soon appeared in the newspapers and on television screens around the world. And at that moment, the protest emerged into a powerful, no longer local, but international, deeply rooted movement. To make matters worse, the government's response spurred more anger. While Ngo Dinh didn't do anything about it, Madame Nhu, publicly and with some essence of joy, it almost seemed, dismissed the immolations as, quote, barbecues, and offered to furnish the gasoline and matches for more. By midsummer, South Vietnamese society appeared on the verge of disintegration. That crisis brought a painful consternation to a Washington politics scene already uneasy over its Vietnam policy. The administration was caught off guard by the protest, surprised by the response, and shocked by the immolation of the monk. Now they feared that these ominous developments might undercut their support for the war and further endanger a counterinsurgency program. Many suspected it was already failing, though. The administration frantically attempted to reconcile the two sides together, sending a number of emissaries to talk with Buddhist leaders and pressing Diem to take conciliatory measures. They failed. Americans could never really determine what the Buddhists wanted, and Diem and Nhu were obstinate. Diem defiantly proclaimed that he would not permit himself and his country to be humiliated, even if the Americans, quote, trained their artillery on this place. Nhu instructed the Americans that it was impossible to fight a war with a guilty conscience, and appealed for an aid program without strings like the one provided during World War II when the U.S. assisted Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin without approving his regime. Nolting's appointment as ambassador expired in the summer of 1963. During his farewell visit, Ngo Dinh had assured him, as a personal favor, that no further repressive measures would be taken against the Buddhists between him and the next ambassador coming in. Nolting left on the morning of August 21st, and Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. would not get to the country until the 22nd. But on August 21st, Madame Nhu, that night, had U.S.-trained special forces that were South Vietnamese. She had them carry out massive raids in Hue, Saigon, and several other cities, and ransacked the Buddhist pagodas and arrested more than 1,400 Buddhists. Whether or not Diem approved the raids in advance remains unclear, but in the eyes of most Americans, his subsequent refusal to disavow Nhu's actions placed the onus of responsibility squarely upon him. These latest actions, just days after the solemn pledges to Nolting, appeared to the anti-Diem folks back home a deliberate affront, and it demanded a firm response. Since the Kennedy administration had taken office, consideration had been given to Diem's replacement, but they couldn't find anyone. A duty to intervene in South Vietnam affairs was not something that they saw fit. We could not sit around and still be the puppets of Diem's anti-Buddhist policies, Roger Hilsman later recalled, thinking the moment that that policy switched. Within several days after the raid on the pagodas, a group of South Vietnamese army generals opened secret contacts with the U.S. The most recent incident made clear, they warned, that New would stop at nothing, reporting evidence that he was not only planning their execution, but also discussing with Hanoi, remember that's North Vietnam, a deal that would sell out the independence of South Vietnam. The generals inquired how the United States might respond should they rise up in a coup against their own government. The anti-Ziem group in Washington was undoubtedly alarmed by the reports that New was making overtures to Hanoi, and the reports reinforced their conviction that something must be done. More importantly, perhaps, the general's inquiries suggested that there was actually an alternative. The general's overtures arrived in Washington on a Saturday when many top officials were out of town. When three men, Hillsman, Forrestal, and Harriman, seized the opportunity to execute what Taylor later called an egregious end run, they prepared a tough, if somewhat ambiguous, cable instructing the newly appointed ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., to give Ziem an opportunity to rid himself of New, but adding to that cable that if he refused, the U.S. must, quote, face the possibility that Ziem himself cannot be preserved. They also instructed Lodge to make clear to the generals that the United States would not continue to support Ziem if he refused to cooperate, and that it would provide them with, quote, direct support in any interim period of breakdown of central government mechanism. These last words were left deliberately vague in what the United States might do under what circumstances, but the thrust of the message was unmistakable. If Ziem remained obdurate, the United States was prepared to abandon him entirely. The cable was cleared with President Kennedy, who was vacationing in Cape Cod, and the endorsement of the president was apparently used to secure the acquiescence of responsible officials in the Defense Department. Lodge wasted no time implementing his instructions. He knew from the first day that he stepped foot in Saigon that a change of government was necessary, and he was determined to help put an end to the Ziem regime. Now, by the time that Kennedy met with his advisors on Monday, August 26th, the U.S., as an official government agency, knew that a change was necessary. The meeting that they went into was tense and marked by a sometimes bitter exchange. Taylor and McNamara protested that instructions for a basic change in policy had been sent to Lodge behind their backs. The president himself was furious with the way the change had been effected, and he said, quote, "This shit has got to stop." He was unhappy with the change itself, feeling, as one of his advisors later put it, that he had been painted into a corner and would have preferred to give an even more ambivalent answer to the generals. Significantly, however, he did not retreat from the policy that had been established. In subsequent messages, he advised Lodge to proceed cautiously, but he reaffirmed the instructions of August 24th and gave the ambassador unusually broad discretion in the implementation of his plans. Lodge was authorized to repeat to the generals' assurances that while the United States would not assist them in a coup, it would support a new government that appeared to have a good chance of success. And he was authorized to announce publicly and at his own discretion a reduction in American aid to Ngo Dinh Diem. This public announcement was what the South Vietnamese generals had requested as a covert indication of the United States' support of their plan. While officials in Washington and Saigon nervously awaited the general's response, the plans for a coup gradually became unraveled. The leaders of the plot were unable to secure the support of key army units in the Saigon area, and despite assurances given by the CIA go-between, they remained uncertain of American support, and it was called off. Although it came to nothing, it marked a major turning point in American policy in Vietnam. Many officials had grave reservations about the desirability, feasibility, and possible consequences of a coup, but the anti-Ziemists were able to commit to the administration to their point of view. By making such a commitment, the administration encouraged opponents of the Ziem regime, pardon me, I just can't help but make that rhyme, and they made it difficult, if not impossible, for any real reconciliation to happen with him. As Lodge put it, the United States was, quote, launched on a course from which there is no respectable turning back. Over the next 4 weeks, the Kennedy administration and his advisors, they went over the options that they had at hand. There wasn't many. They were worried that new was really the issue with the problem of South Vietnam. They didn't think it could be stabilized with him there. They were also worried about him making a deal with Hanoi that would force the United States out of Vietnam entirely. They concluded that the administration must therefore apply a firm pressure on Ngo Dinh Diem, including aid cuts, to compel him to move new and adopt the changes in policy necessary to defeat the Viet Cong. By this time, the administration was more divided on Vietnam than it had been on any other issue. Kennedy himself quoted, "My God, my government's coming apart." Such was the confusion and the perplexity that at one point, in a moment of frustration, his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, or Bobby, blurted out the ultimate question. He wondered aloud whether any South Vietnamese government was capable of winning the war, and whether the United States should not begin to extricate itself from an impossible web that it found itself tangled in. The question was appropriate and timely. The disarray in South Vietnam was reaching a point where both factions in the administration may have been right. The country could not be stabilized with or without Diem. The aid cuts that they gave to the South Vietnamese Diem-led government are telling. And today, when you hear of the news and hear of a country cutting aid to another, there's a lot more there than is on the surface. Such is the case here. The aid cuts sent another signal to those generals just from not long before this who attempted a coup the first time that did not work out. Well, those aid cuts were a signal to them that they were ready to do another one. And once aware that the generals were again planning a coup, this time the administration did nothing to discourage them. The response to their inquiry was sufficiently vague to salve the consciences of those who preferred a coup but hesitated to accept direct responsibility for it, and to satisfy the reservations of those who remained wary of dumping Diem. But the instructions offered the assurances the generals sought. Lodge was authorized to inform the plotters that although the United States did not, quote, wish to stimulate a coup, it would not, quote, thwart a change of government or deny economic and military assistance to a new regime if it appeared capable of increasing the effectiveness of the military effort, ensuring popular support to win the war, and improving working relations with the United States. And that is a Pentagon paper from the CIA to the ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. In keeping with the overall theme of the Vietnam War, in the last week of that October, Saigon was gripped with tension and flooded with rumors as various actors played out their complicated and ultimately tragic roles in this unfolding drama. Determined to avoid the mistakes of 1960 and August of 63, the generals lined up their forces with the closest attention to every detail. Keenly aware, as he said it, that, quote, the elephants were crashing in the jungle, New concocted a elaborate scheme to keep himself and his brother in power by staging a fake coup, and he would use it as an excuse for eliminating suspected opponents. To complicate matters even further, in the last hours before the real coup, Ngo Dinh Diem suddenly turned conciliatory, inquiring to Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. at their last meeting what the United States wanted of him. Now, whether or not he was merely trying to buy himself more time or he had concluded that he must place himself in the hands of his ally, it's unclear. Either way, his apparent concession came too late. While he was talking with Lodge in the early afternoon of November 1st, the generals made their move, and they seized key military installations and communication systems in Saigon, secured the surrender of New's special forces, and demanded the resignation of Ngo Dinh Diem and New. Defiant to the bitter end, the brothers requested that the generals come to the palace for consultation. That ploy had worked in 1960, and Ngo Dinh Diem phoned Henry Cabot Lodge to determine the official American attitude towards the coup. They found no support. They escaped through a secret underground passage to a Catholic church in the Chinese district of the city. It was where they went to give confession and receive communion. Even though they escaped, they were subsequently captured. And although, despite promises of safe conduct, they were brutally tortured. Not only were they brutally tortured, but they were murdered in the back of a van, and they were buried in an unmarked grave. And that was the end of the story of Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam. The news of the coup and the bloody deaths of the Ngo family evoked mixed reactions. In Saigon, jubilant crowds smashed statues of Ngo Dinh Diem. They danced in the streets, and they covered ARVN soldiers with garlands of flowers. Quote, "Every Vietnamese has a grin on his face today," Henry Cabot Lodge excitedly informed Washington. In the ancient Vietnamese tradition, the mandate of heaven had passed. Among Americans, there was a sense of relief and satisfaction. But the deaths of Diem and Ngo were unsettling. The generals first attributed them to a, quote, accidental suicide, but photographs of the two mutilated bodies with hands tied behind their backs made clear, as McGeorge Bundy sarcastically put it, that this was, quote, not the preferred way to commit suicide. Some of Kennedy's advisors accepted the deaths as a matter of course. Helmsman said, quote, "Revolutions are rough, people get hurt." But Kennedy himself was deeply troubled. When he learned of the slaying of Diem and Ngo, he said, quote, he leaped to his feet. This is a quote from his advisor Taylor. He said, quote, "He leaped to his feet and rushed from the room with a look of shock and dismay on his face, which I had never seen before. When someone justified the deaths on the ground that the two men were tyrants, the president retorted that, quote, they did the best they could for their country." People close to him found Kennedy more depressed than at any time since the Bay of Pigs, and speculated that he realized that Vietnam had been his greatest foreign policy failure. Just 3 weeks after that, though, Kennedy himself was assassinated in Dallas. His defenders, many of whom would become outspoken opponents of the war, would later argue that he was planning to extricate the United States from what he had concluded was a quagmire. He undoubtedly harbored deep-seated doubts about the prospects for success in South Vietnam, and he had adamantly opposed the commitment of U.S. combat troops. On Laos and other issues, he had shown flexibility, and he had grown demonstrably more secure in office since his first day. A good case can therefore be made that when he faced the collapse of South Vietnam, he might have taken a close look at diplomatic solutions. However, at the same time, there's no persuasive evidence that he was committed to withdrawal. He had resisted negotiations as firmly as he had opposed combat troops. In a speech that was to be given on the day of his death, he conceded that commitments in the Third World nations would be, quote, painful, risky, and costly. And although he knew those things about this war, he also added to the end of his speech that, quote, "We shall not weary of the test." However, what Kennedy might have done can never be known for certain, of course. His administration must be judged on what it actually did during its short and brief tenure. The president and most of his advisors uncritically accepted the assumption that a non-communist South Vietnam was vital to America's global interests. The president never really devoted his full attention to Vietnam. As his defenders claim, that seems clear. He reacted to crises, if that's a word, crises, and improved his responses on a day-to-day basis. He seldom explained or examined the implications of his actions. Now, this cautious middle course significantly enlarged the American role and commitment in Vietnam. Like most of his advisors, he acted on the somewhat arrogant presumption that the United States knew what was best and what was right for Vietnam. Quote, "In the name of the struggle against the Viet Cong," historian Ellen Hammer has written, the Americans, quote, "claimed the right to intervene as they chose. they overthrew the Diem government primarily because it resisted their advice. With the coup, the United States assumed direct responsibility for the South Vietnamese government. Whatever his fears or his ultimate intentions, Kennedy bequeathed the situation to his successor, a problem imminently more dangerous than the one that he had inherited. John F. Kennedy was declared dead on November 22nd, 1963. I believe it was a Tuesday, and I believe it was even around noon, but that's not really that important right now. From that November of 63, and if you fast forwarded to July of 1965, the man that JFK left this situation to was a stark contrast between him and Lyndon Baines Johnson. What LBJ did was he transformed a limited commitment to assist the South Vietnamese government into an open-ended commitment to preserve an independent, non-communist South Vietnam. Fearing that a large-scale involvement would jeopardize his chances of election in '64 and threaten his beloved Great Society domestic programs, which he was sincerely focused on, he wanted to revamp the domestic program. He didn't want anything to do with domestic or foreign affairs. He temporized over a year about expanding American assistance and increasing the number of advisors in hope that a beefed-up version of his predecessor's policy might somehow stave off disaster in Vietnam. Over the next 9 months, he made his fateful decisions and ended up authorizing a sustained air offensive against North Vietnam and dispatching ground forces to stem the tide in the South. So in just under 2 years, the United States was engaged in a major war on the Asian mainland. Now, I think it's important first, before we go too far ahead of ourselves, to understand just who LBJ was, especially in contrast with JFK, because the two men could not be farther apart. Now, when I say that the two men could not have been more far apart from each other, I guess that is, it could be an unfair assessment, because if you have been listening to this show from the beginning, you would know that I have somewhat of a fascination with JFK and his Camelot administration. And that's where the biggest difference comes in with LBJ. JFK was Harvard educated, and if you go before him, Dwight D. Eisenhower, he saved the world. He led the free peoples of the Allied armies against the aggressor Adolf Hitler and the Germans and Japanese to vanquish the foes. And if you go before him, Harry S. Truman was a haberdasher who obviously knew how to dress, from Kansas, and had class, and not to mention he was the first person to drop the atomic bomb, let alone the only one to use it in a military conflict, and I guess that counts for something. But then you have Lyndon Baines Johnson. His suits weren't cut correctly. He was tall, brash, a Texan, and if you think JFK and his Boston French language that he used was harsh, LBJ makes him seem like a choir boy. Now, despite that, LBJ had a reputation as an honest, no-nonsense politician who spoke his mind and was eager to get things done. He hailed from a conservative southern state, and despite that, his real passion was domestic reform. Johnson dreamed of creating what he called, like I said, the Great Society, and he wanted to use American affluence to combat poverty and public housing shortfalls and gaps in public education and job shortages. He was extremely passionate about that and ending racial discrimination, particularly in his native land of the South, just like JFK before him. He was, of course, an anti-communist, because you couldn't not be one in the government at that time, and he was an advocate of the domino theory like all the other people during this time. Now, just days after taking office, he reaffirmed his country's commitment to the government and people of South Vietnam. Now, by his own admission, the new president was less informed and probably less interested in foreign policy than domestic issues, like I said. But he was very well traveled. He was keenly aware of history and astute enough to understand the situation in Vietnam was fairly critical. In his memoir, which you have to take with a grain of salt because it's written in 1971, and you can only assume that they're telling the truth, but again, like I said, with a grain of salt because they're writing about the past after it happened, he said, quote, "I knew from the start that I was bound to be crucified either way I moved. If I left the woman I really loved, the Great Society, in order to get involved with that bitch of a war on the other side of the world, then I would lose everything at home. All my programs, all my hopes to feed the hungry and shelter the homeless, all my dreams to provide education and medical care to the browns and the blacks and the lame and the poor. But if I left that war and let the communists take over South Vietnam, then I would be seen as a coward and my nation would be seen as an appeaser. And we would both find it impossible to accomplish anything for anybody, anywhere on the entire globe." And that is a bit of a generous take on his situation. I'll dive into that further, but his decision-making with regard to Vietnam was shaped by advice from foreign policy experts and military chiefs. Not to mention, the biggest factor of it was his own worries about his re-election and his personal public appearance and the appearance of the war. By early 1964, these advisors had reached a consensus that the communists in Indochina could be defeated in the short to medium term if the U.S. became more directly involved. It seems like repeating a broken record. They say this over and over and over again. With each president, they say the same thing. Now, a combination of American military intervention, sustained aerial bombing, and repeated offers of peace, they claimed, would force them to surrender and withdraw to North Vietnam. With them contained, Johnson was advised that Vietnam would evolve as two politically distinct states, just the same way that Korea had done after the armistice of, I want to say it was 1953. And technically, I guess they're still at war. But this strategy was articulated by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, and it was endorsed by the military general staff and others in LBJ's inner circle, and a lot of people in Congress supported this. But there was, of course, voices of dissent and disagreement, and one of the loudest voices of disagreement was Undersecretary of State George Ball. He was a longstanding critic of military action in Vietnam, and from Kennedy's election in 1960, he strongly advised against direct U.S. involvement. He preferred what he called an arm's length policy. In 1961, he had a conversation with McNamara and some other officials that said, quote, "We must not commit forces to South Vietnam or we would find ourselves in a protracted conflict, far more serious than Korea. The Viet Cong were mean and tough, as the French had learned to their sorrow, and there was always danger of provoking Chinese intervention as we had in Korea. The Vietnam problem was not one of repelling overt invasion, but of mixing ourselves up in a revolutionary situation with strong anti-colonialist overtones." He continued and said, "Within 5 years, we'll have 300,000 men in the paddies and jungles and never find them again," he warned the president. Ball also emphasized the precedent of the French defeat in Vietnam. Kennedy seemed unimpressed by Ball's arguments, saying, quote, "George, you're just crazier than hell. That just isn't going to happen." And that was from an American historian, Frank E. Vandiver. He also said that, quote, "McNamara's report confirmed everything LBJ had heard about Southeast Asia. Laos might fall to the communists any day, and the government of South Vietnam might collapse overnight." Clearly, American policy there sagged from a shambles toward a catastrophe situation. He knew, Johnson did, that sooner or later he would have to decide whether the U.S. got farther in or out. For Johnson, at the end of 1963, and remember he came into office in November, so he only had 1 month left of the year, any decision might affect the election of 1964. He wanted to run, and he wanted to win, but the question was, would the war in that, as he called it, quote, "damn little pissant country," blow up into an election disaster and smash his entire campaign? And this is the part of the story where the war really takes a turn. The story takes a very bitter, dark turn when LBJ takes the reins. And it's not entirely LBJ's fault. I'm really not going to go easy on him here, and you might think that I don't believe the words I just said, but I think the best way to sum it up in just a few words is I took a history class, and it was about this period of history in American history. And at the end of the course, we had to write a big, I think it was 10 pages maybe, paper just to kind of surmise what happened. And I titled my paper, LBJ, Damned If He Did, Damned If He Didn't. And it was in regards to he was damned if he didn't go into Vietnam, and if he was going to go into Vietnam, he was also damned. He had no choice. And when I say that, I do mean that he really didn't have a good way to act. However, the way he did act and the methods he used, those are entirely on him. So his own views on Vietnam were fairly conflicted. He accepted the domino theory just like everyone else, and he was wary of the dangers of appeasement because Hitler was not far from his memory. He accepted the advice of his generals, who told him that the Vietnam conflict was winnable, and in early '64 he told an audience that, quote, "If we quit Vietnam tomorrow, we'll be fighting in Hawaii, and next week we'll have to be fighting in San Francisco." But Johnson was also concerned about the presidential election due in November of '64. He knew very well that committing American troops to another foreign war in an election year would be a political suicide, and that losing the election would spell the great end of his great society reforms. Over the Christmas season of '63, Johnson reportedly told military commanders and some warhawks in his administration to, quote, "Just get me elected and then you can have your damn war." Though he backed his advisors, he admitted to having nagging doubts about America's military prospects in Vietnam. Just like Robert E. Lee knew they were running a fool's errand not even 100 years before then. He repeatedly sought advice and reassurance that North Vietnam was incapable of matching American escalation. I think he just wanted to have someone lie to him so he could feel better. What it all boils down to was that Lyndon Baines Johnson was concerned about his appearance politically more than the war, more than the men fighting in it, and more than the men dying in it. Now, when that becomes your structure of priority, how could any war become anything close to being considered justified or a positive evil? Earlier, at the beginning of the Civil War series, I asked the question of what classifies a war as a good war or a bad war. This is whole 100% all parts a bad war, and it takes that turn right here with LBJ. And what he did was he linked Vietnam to his domestic political fortunes. He saw the American commitment there as a vital part of the Kennedy program that he had sworn to uphold. He had been at the center of the political bloodletting that had followed the fall of China in '49, and he was certain that the loss of Vietnam would produce an even more explosive upheaval than that. Quote, "A mean and destructive debate that would shatter my presidency, kill my administration, and damage our democracy." Early in his presidency, he set out to create what he called, again, the Great Society. He's largely given credit as the most ambitious creator of a legislative program of domestic reform since FDR's New Deal. He also tied Vietnam to the realization of those goals, and he feared that if he showed weakness, the Southern conservatives who opposed his domestic programs, especially his commitment to racial equality, would attack him with a vengeance. And he said, quote, "If I don't go in now and then they show later that I should have, then they'll push Vietnam up my ass every time." Most foreign policy experts still believed, however, that it was essential to hold the line in Vietnam. The ethos of the Cold War by this time was deeply ingrained in the way of life, and it put a premium on even just the appearance of toughness. The U.S. had to continue to display the certainty of purpose and their strength of will against their communist enemies. And I might as well be fair to LBJ. a lot of Americans had grown increasingly concerned about Vietnam by the time that LBJ was in office. Some, including LBJ, were questioning whether it was important enough to justify a major war. LBJ was worried it might be hopeless. He said, quote, "It's just the biggest damned mess I ever saw." He conceded to his advisors that he wasn't sure what to do. Some key senators began urging the president to disengage the U.S. Johnson was keenly aware of the pitfalls, politically, of escalation. He said, quote, "It's damned easy to get into a war, but it's going to be awfully hard to extricate yourself if you get in." Now, even though they hadn't showed these concerns, they all chose to stay. He was a man of action rather than reflection, and the president did not subject an increasingly dangerous situation to searching reappraisal. He dismissed out of hand the idea of an American withdrawal from Vietnam, and he rejected, without serious consideration, the neutralization scheme that had been proposed by Charles de Gaulle, the cowardly leader of France. And I say that because of the World War II episodes with de Gaulle in it. If you haven't heard those, you should go listen to me hate on an entire group of people. Anyways, Johnson had made Vietnam a touchstone for his presidency. He couldn't bear the prospect of failure. He took the image of falling dominoes seriously. He obsessed with appearing weak. He could not accept the idea of being president the first time that he said, quote, "We've ever turned tail and been shoved out of a place." He did not like the fact that the U.S. was bogged down in Vietnam, but it was there. He concluded it was there, and he said, quote, "We've got to conduct ourselves like men," which was a fairly ironic statement for him to make at that time. Now, despite his concern for Vietnam, President Johnson was not really prepared to employ American military power on a large scale in early 1964, at least not without a reason. Like Kennedy and Eisenhower before him, he had just about zero enthusiasm for a massive engagement of American forces on the Asian mainland. He and his advisors, feared that Americanization of the war would further undercut the self-reliance of the Vietnamese, who would then just fall victim to the North Vietnamese communists once they left. Most important, though, it would cause major disruptions at home. It would threaten LBJ's legislative program and his campaign for the presidency. On March 17th of 1964, a United States military objective titled NSAM 288 was approved, and it stated U.S. objectives in Vietnam in much more sweeping terms. It emphasized as the essential goal to achieve the preservation of an independent, non-communist South Vietnam. It stated that while they were aware that the most urgent problem was the weakness of the South Vietnamese government, Washington publicly affirmed its support for the new leader, Khan, and privately advised the U.S. mission to do everything possible to avert a further coup. NSAM 288 also called for a national mobilization plan to put South Vietnam on a war footing and for significantly increasing the size of its armed forces. For this task, LBJ appointed General William Westmoreland. He was a decorated paratrooper, a veteran of World War II and the Korean War, and he would replace the ineffectual and perennial optimistic General Harkins. Over the next 9 months, the U.S. increased its quote-unquote advisors from 16,300 to 23,300, which is not quite a double, but it's nearly there in 9 months. And that's a staggering increase if you consider that they've had that 16,500 for the last couple years. On top of that, LBJ expanded the economic assistance to South Vietnam by another $50 million. In a dispatch to Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. in April of that year, LBJ said, quote, "As far as I'm concerned, you must have whatever you need to help the Vietnamese do the job, and I assure you that I will act at once to eliminate obstacles or restraints wherever they may appear." Now, although his administration did little more than reaffirm the existing policy in the spring of '64, its attention was shifting increasingly towards North Vietnam and away from South. The change reflected a growing American concern over the infiltration of people and supplies from the North and mounting frustration with the ground rules that permitted Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, to support the insurgency with impunity. Some U.S. officials seem also to have concluded that action against the North might somehow compensate for the lack of progress in the South. It's a foolhardy thought, hindsight, but that's the interesting thing about history is you have to take into account what they were going through at that time. Others in the administration really wished to signal to Hanoi that it would pay a very high price for its continued, they called it an intervention, if they didn't back down. So the administration intensified its planning to prepare U.S. forces for possible, quote, border control operations into Cambodia and Laos, who were no-go zones for the U.S. right now, and they called it a tit-for-tat retaliatory bombing raid into North Vietnam and a series of, quote, graduated overt pressures against North Vietnam. It included air attacks against military and industrial targets. Warnings were delivered to Hanoi through a Canadian intermediary, and the National Security Council meeting on March 17th, the top administration officials expressed confidence that increased military and economic aid would be enough to stem the tide in South Vietnam. Should be deja vu. That's about the fifth or sixth time we've heard that from an official report to any one of the last four presidents we've been talking about. They also agreed that the failure of the program outlined in NSAM 288 might compel them to take the war to North Vietnam. So for one of the first times, we're actually preparing an aggressive offensive campaign strategy here. So at this point, the U.S. was really hoping that the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which is the allied South Vietnamese army, was going to be able to hold off the North Vietnamese insurgents and official North Vietnamese army. But as a result of spiraling desertion rates, the strength of the army of ARVN remained drastically well below the figure authorized before the projected increase that the U.S. was looking at. The ARVN won a few minor engagements in the early summer of that year, but it was never able to really gain a foothold or gain the strategic initiative. American officials would publicly praise the leader Khan's, quote, able and energetic leadership, which is kind of an empty compliment to receive if you're the leader of a country and you're the puppet. And he dutifully followed American suggestions for gaining popular support by visiting numerous villages and cities, and he even made a series of fireside chats to take a page directly out of the playbook of Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II. But while a word from well-placed Americans could topple governments in Vietnam, it had no power to create actual stability, and speeches were inadequate to actually bring together South Vietnam's disparate political forces. The Catholics and Buddhists, remember, were pretty much mobilizing against each other, and they were agitated a government that neither trusted. After a brief period, the students, because that's where this movement really began, the students of the Catholic and the Buddhist movements, they began to stir again. The government itself was wrought with internal dissension, and a coup plot in July failed only because the U.S. made known its opposition to the plan. Maxwell Taylor replaced Henry Cabot Lodge as ambassador in midsummer of that year, and he reported in August that the best thing that can be said about Khan's government is that it, quote, has lasted 6 months and has about a 50-50 chance of lasting out the year. What optimistic odds to be faced with. Now, in the meantime, North Vietnam was not sitting by idly. Hanoi responded very defiantly to the American warnings that they were given, and there's no reason to suppose that the North Vietnamese leaders wanted war with the U.S., but they seem to have hoped that the intensification of the aid to the Northern Liberation Forces would topple the government in South Vietnam. After all, they had already seen one go down in flames, and it didn't seem like it would be too much longer before this one would really suicide itself. They hoped to leave the U.S. with no choice but to abandon its ally and leave Vietnam entirely. In the summer of '64, North Vietnam began mobilizing its own forces for war. They intensified transformation of the Ho Chi Minh Trail into a modern logistical network capable of handling large trucks, and it's truly a impressive feat what they were able to do. And they began to prepare units of their own regular army for infiltration into South Vietnam. The premier, Pham Van Dong, bluntly informed the Canadian intermediary in June that the stakes were as high for North Vietnam as for the U.S., and that the NLF and the supporters were prepared to endure regardless of the cost. If the U.S. insisted on war, he concluded with a ringing declaration, quote, "We shall win." Now, under these circumstances, Americans increasingly looked north for a solution that they couldn't find in the South. They were alarmed by the continual lack of progress in South Vietnam. They were annoyed by North Vietnam's defiant responses to their warnings, and they were fearful that the North Vietnamese might seek to exploit the LBJ administration's presumed immobility in an election year. Some of LBJ's advisors in '64 had developed a full scenario of graduated pressures against the North, according to which the president, after securing a congressional resolution, would authorize airstrikes against selected Vietnamese targets. Henry Rusk, and Robert McNamara finally rejected the program for fear that it would, quote, raise a whole series of disagreeable questions that might jeopardize passage of the administration's civil rights legislations. But the proposals indicate the drift of official attitudes during this period. That is to say, those disagreeable questions, it's really just one question, and that's going to Congress asking for approval to declare war. I think that's one of my biggest pet peeves, I guess, on a personal level, is that the last war the United States actually declared on an official capacity was World War II. We've been finding ways to skirt, I say we, the people that we have put in charge have found ways to increase the powers of their office and skirt around the Constitution that is meant to protect us from the very things that they're doing. But I'm not going to go down that road because this is all about Vietnam. So basically, they were waiting for something to happen. They couldn't attack North Vietnam outright without congressional approval, but they weren't going to sit around and sit on their hands and just hope for something to get them out of the situation. And on August 2nd of 1964, they just about got their scapegoat for war. The U.S. decided to launch these patrols, these naval patrols that they called the Desoto Patrols. They would carry out electronic espionage on North Vietnam, and they would put them provocatively close to the borders, almost begging to be attacked as an excuse to retaliate. And on August 2nd, they did. They got attacked. It was a destroyer group led by the USS Maddox. On the afternoon of August 2nd, they encountered a group of North Vietnam torpedo boats. Because the USS Maddox was leading this group, the North Vietnamese assumed that it was part of the afternoon before that, and the day before, covert attacks by the South Vietnamese Navy on a group of islands nearby. So they opened attack on the Maddox. The torpedo boats were driven away, and one was badly damaged, and nothing really of consequence happened to the Maddox. But LBJ was reportedly enraged when he learned of the encounter, but no retaliation was ordered. Henry Rusk remarked that, quote, the other side will get a sting out of this. If they do it again, they'll get another sting. And all to avoid any appearance of weakness and to assert traditional claims to freedom of the seas, the Navy ordered the USS Maddox to resume operations in the Gulf of Tonkin, and that should give you an idea of what's about to happen, and sent the destroyer named the Sea Turner Joy to support the Maddox. Now, the U.S. might not have been seeking to provoke another attack, but it wasn't necessarily going out of its way to avoid one either. The administration kept the destroyers close to North Vietnamese shores, skirting the lines nearly of the borders, where they were incredibly vulnerable to an attack. They were eager for an open season on a nation that already looked upon as the enemy. Responsible military officials in the area were choosing targets for retaliatory raids before the reports of a second attack even began to come in. On the night of August 4th, we have one of the most, I guess the word to describe it is bizarre events in America's military, well, hell, their entire history. So they were operating in heavy seas about 60 miles off of the North Vietnamese coast. The Maddox and the Turner Joy, suddenly out of nowhere, reported coming under attack. The initial reports were based on sonar and radar contacts only, both of which were admittedly unreliable, and especially under the adverse weather conditions that they were in, and on sightings of torpedoes and enemy searchlights on a night that one seaman described as, quote, darker than the hubs of hell. It seems odd that you would be seeing those lights on a night that was just pitch black dark. The captain of the Maddox later conceded that evidence of an attack was somewhat less than conclusive, and North Vietnamese gunboats may have been operating in the area, but no evidence to this day has ever been produced to demonstrate that they committed hostile acts, and it now today seems nearly certain that no second attack even took place. But to the administration and the people calling the shots back home, that didn't matter. Washington was poised to strike back. I have a bit of I guess you could call it a trump card. I guess that's a controversial word to use, the Trump word these days, but I'm sticking clear of politics and sticking to history because that's my way out of pissing off everyone that listens to the show. But I took a class on Vietnam when I was at Clemson, and it was taught by Professor Edwin E. Moise, Moise, and there's an umlaut above the I. And he's largely regarded as one of the foremost experts on the Vietnam War, specifically with the Gulf of Tonkin. And I'm using a lot of his book on it. It's called Tonkin Gulf and the Escalation of the Vietnam War, published in 1996 at Chapel Hill, North Carolina. The advantage I have over most people studying this history or just looking for the story of this is I have his perspective, and he interviewed just about every sailor and officer that was present at the Gulf of Tonkin incident that night and that was willing to, or still alive, be interviewed. And he told us all about it, and it was fascinating. He said that there was about a 50-50 split of sailors who swore to this day that they were under attack as sure as they've ever been, and sailors who said that from the get-go they knew that nothing was going on at all. So after this incident on August 4th, the Joint Chiefs immediately insisted that the U.S. must, quote, clobber the attackers. Throughout the morning, while the destroyers reported being under continuous attack, the Joint Chiefs of Staff worked out a series of retaliation options. They ranged from limited airstrikes against North Vietnam to naval installations to mining of parts of the coastline. And when the president met with his advisors in the early afternoon, there seemed absolutely no doubt that an attack had taken place. The CIA pointed out quite logically that the North Vietnamese might be responding out of pride and defensively to the commando raids on their territory just 2 days before. But the administration, in all their wisdom, concluded that Hanoi was trying to make the U.S. appear to be a, quote, paper tiger. And Dean Rusk announced, I think I've been saying Henry Rusk, I believe it's Dean Rusk, my apologies. He denounced the attacks as, quote, an act of war, determined to prove their toughness, because that's what all of this was about. It was about saving face, and for the future elections, LBJ and his advisors agreed, as McNamara put it, that, quote, we cannot sit still as a nation and let them attack us on high seas and get away with it. They all quickly decided on a firm, swift, retaliatory airstrike against the North Vietnamese torpedo boat bases. Although serious questions were subsequently raised about the alleged attacks, the administration stuck by its decision. There were flash messages from the USS Maddox indicating that the freak weather effects on the radar and sonar, as well as over-eager sonarmen, may have accounted for almost all of the reported torpedo attacks and the enemy contacts that were given. It contradicted earlier message that was sent by the commander of the Maddox that admitted that there had been no visual sightings, that a complete evaluation of all evidence should be made before retaliation was ordered. They did postpone the airstrikes temporarily to make, quote, as McNamara put it, damn sure that the attacks had taken place. By late afternoon, however, they were convinced either way, and on the basis of evidence that now appears to not exist at all. They ignored the belated uncertainty of the men on the scene. The Secretary of Defense accepted at face value the judgment of the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, who was in Honolulu, whose certainty that they were under attack was based solely on reports from the USS Maddox initially and intercepts of North Vietnamese messages indicating that 2 of their patrol boats had been, quote, sacrificed. They did not knowingly lie about the alleged attacks, the administration, but they were obviously in a mood to retaliate, and they seem to have selected from the available evidence the parts that confirmed what they wanted to believe. They accepted McNamara's conclusions without question. LBJ in the late afternoon authorized a retaliatory airstrike against North Vietnamese torpedo boat bases. Probably the most disturbing to someone looking in at a historical and constitutional perspective about all this is that the president, again after Truman had done the same in Korea, seized a golden opportunity to secure passage of a congressional resolution that authorized him to take, quote, all necessary measures to repel any armed attacks against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. Now, his purpose was to indicate to Hanoi that the nation was united in its determination to stand firm in South Vietnam. If you read between the lines there, that's basically saying to Congress, hey, you know that we used to have to get your approval to go to war. Well, this little resolution, it kind of throws that in the trash. So you guys can just hang back. I've got this. And it's a blatant... It's a danger to the future of America if we continue to allow the powers of the Constitution to be abused. But again, I digress. I don't want to get onto a political tangent. The resolution did also serve the immediate domestic political needs of LBJ's administration. The show of force and the appeal for national support permitted him to disarm his Republican challenger, Senator Barry Goldwater, who was a Republican from Arizona, who had vigorously urged escalation of the war, and to demonstrate that he would be firm in defending American interests without recklessly expanding the war. You might recall the commercial of the girl on a swing who is then disappeared by the flash of a nuclear bomb going off. That's one of Goldwater's campaign advertisements. Now, about these covert raids, nothing was said about them. Official reports indicated that the Maddox was engaged in routine patrols in international waters, and they were portrayed as deliberate attacks and open aggression on the high seas. Congress responded quickly and pliantly because they were lied to. They raised some embarrassing questions about the covert raids and the mission of the American destroyers, and they attempted to limit the grant of authority to the executive branch. During a period when America's national interests seemed constantly in peril, however, Congress had grown accustomed to approving presidential initiatives without much question. Now, if you look at this from a domestic political standpoint, and what LBJ was very well known for, the handling of this Tonkin Gulf incident was masterful. His firm but restrained response to the alleged attacks, it won broad popular support. His rating in the Lewis Harris poll skyrocketed from 42 to 72% overnight. He effectively neutralized his opponent Goldwater on Vietnam, a fact that contributed to his overwhelming electoral victory that November. And this first formal congressional debate on Vietnam brought a near unanimous endorsement of the president's policies and provided him an apparently solid foundation on which to construct future policy. In time, though, Johnson would pay a heavy price for his easy victory. U.S. prestige was now publicly and more firmly committed, not merely to defending South Vietnam, but also to responding to North Vietnamese provocations. So the president had temporarily silenced his hawkish critics inside and outside of the government, but in doing so, he had sealed his own coffin in the fate that would force his hand to escalate the war to a point that we couldn't go back from, and to a point that no one ever wanted to see in the first place. Although the Tonkin Gulf incident had occurred and there was a congressional resolution called the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, and although the U.S. had committed to continuing these covert attacks while being prepared for a North Vietnamese retaliation in which they would themselves retaliate, Johnson's reluctance to escalate the war, or his supposed reluctance, would soon be gone. Most historians and scholars now agree that the later months of 1964 and the early of 1965 were the most pivotal period in his entire escalation of the Vietnam War. Now, during this time, he initiated a fundamentally altering action of the U.S. commitment by initiating regular bombings of North Vietnam and by sending the first U.S. ground combat troops to South Vietnam. This is the mark that kicks off the beginning of the hottest period of the Vietnam War, and it's the point in which LBJ begins to lose his grip and lose his control on the situation. We'll pick up in the next episode and go more onto it, but just to give you an idea of how much bombing he issued, in North Vietnam, the United States dropped more bombs and more tonnage, explosive tonnage, on North Vietnam than every single explosive tonnage, including bullets, artillery fire, and bombs, that all sides dropped or fired in the entirety of the whole war during World War II. Should put it into perspective for you that while LBJ was reluctant to begin, he certainly dove right in with a plan that would fundamentally alter the future for the United States of America in the Indochina region, and for that matter, the entire world.